Hello lovely people, welcome to my channel. It's Hila here, Saturday Night Stitch, and today we're going to be doing a sew along of this cover dress in Burda 6 2023. It is a lovely sundress that features some princess seams and some tiered skirt gathering. I will be making this in a really gorgeous viscose linen. The version that I'm making, even though dress number 103 has the flounces on the straps, I will not be putting the flounces on there. I will be using a combination of dress number 104 and dress number 103 in the sense that I'm using the bodice piece without the extra flounces. So with your Burda, you need to check which tracing line you need. In this particular one, we need the black line on pattern sheet D. I've already taken my pattern sheets out of the magazine. I use a D stapler to do that, which is one of those nifty little bits of stationery that allows you to remove the staples without doing serious damage to the paper. And once you've located your pattern sheet D, so D tends to be on the other side of B, which makes it a lot easier, I just unfold it and I will get ahead and trace it. Now, in terms of tracing, over the years that I've been using Burda, I have found that most of the things that I need to trace, I have them in the kitchen. Hence, I do most of my tracing in the kitchen. But before I show you the tracing equipment, how do you spot the pattern piece itself that you need to trace? It's nothing to fear. It's just like geographical coordinates. You find the pattern number, go up vertically, and you will bump into a line that has that number, and then you can find where the pattern piece is. So for me there, that is the front, the bodice front pattern piece. And so it's quite easy. The more you do it, the easier it becomes to see the pattern. I have a quilting ruler that I've had for nearly 10 years now, and this is a great ruler. I always like to use my Staedtler Norris pencils that I sharpen. They work very well on baking parchment. So this is a multitasking equipment in my kitchen because it works really well for tracing out pattern pieces, and you can also use it for baking, so it's a win-win. And I will also use tinned foods to use as pattern ways to hold the baking parchment down, and that's really all I need to do the tracing. And because this pattern, it's quite a simple pattern, it doesn't have as many pattern pieces, it only took me about 20 minutes in total to trace it, which is wonderful. I like patterns that are quite easy to trace out like that. When I trace out my patterns, I do not add the seam allowances. I trace and cut out my patterns without adding the seam allowances. The Burda sewing patterns, they come without seam allowances. So that is to say, you are tracing out the stitch line. And over the years, I've found that it actually works out a lot better to not have the seam allowances. I add in the seam allowances as I cut the fabric, which you'll see in the subsequent videos on this particular tutorial. I do have a lot of videos on how to add seam allowances to Burda patterns. There are so many ways that I've used over the past, but as my sewing skill grew, I eventually came to the conclusion that it actually is better to work without seam allowances. And that's what I tend to do. In fact, when I do have to sew with the big 4 pattern pieces, it's a bit of an adjustment for me because I'm not used to working within the seam allowances now. I always try and make sure that I'm quite frugal, and I try to make sure that I use as much of the baking parchment as I can. So I'll use the edges wherever possible. So with this bodice front, I've got the edge of the baking parchment being the straight grain or the fold line. And making sure when you trace to write down the pattern identification details. So you need to know which pattern you're referencing, whether you need to cut one piece of it, what part is it? Is this the side front or the back front? What size it is, and also I make sure to put no seam allowance on there just so that it's clear that there are no seam allowances on this. And this is because there used to be a point when I used to sew with Burda that I used to add seam allowances as I am tracing. And it's one of the things that is in the tutorials, and I'll link it down below. One thing to note is make sure you mark those seam numbers. They are very important, particularly if you've got a lot of pattern pieces that look similar. And this pattern certainly does that. So the bodice, the top of the dress, is made up of these 4 pattern pieces that are very similar, so much so that I accidentally traced the same one twice before I realized it. Hence, you can see what looks a little bit weird to the right there. And then I will just cut it out. So with this pattern, the skirt portion is basically rectangular panels that are gathered together. The pieces, you can trace them from the pattern sheets. However, as I said, I do try as much as possible not to be wasteful. I don't actually need to trace out the rectangular pattern pieces. So what I'm doing with this is I'm actually just going to measure out the sizes of the pattern pieces. So it's a rectangle, so I just need the width and the length, and I'm going to write that down in the magazine drawing so that I have that, and then I will just cut that directly from the fabric. So just to explain there, you can see I'm using my ruler. I am finding the rectangular pattern piece of the upper skirt bodice, and then I'm just measuring what the width is, and then I am going into my magazine, and then I'm just writing down the measurement, which is in inches. So pattern piece number 5 there measures 12.5 inches by 14.5 inches, and I will just mark this directly onto the fabric itself, and then I'll remember to add my seam allowances, which again you'll see in the subsequent tutorial that I show you. You can do the same thing with pattern piece number 8 if you're going to be making the ruffles. Just measure out what the dimensions are, and you can just cut that out and save yourself on some tracing paper. So this is what I have for today for part 1. In the next section, we are going to be talking about lining versus facings versus bias bound armholes, and I will talk about how we go on from there. So I'll see you in the next one. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and like for more sewing tutorials like this. And if you are worried about doing this without seam allowances and you want to figure out how to add the seam allowances, I do have a video that covers all of the different ways that you could add seam allowances to your Burda pattern, and I will link it into the description box below. Until I see you next time, lovely people, happy sewing. Bye.